What would you do if the only shelter left in the world was a door you weren't sure you had the right to open? The night Harriet Moss turned 53, she slept in her car. Not because she'd planned it that way. Nobody plans it that way. She'd had a plan, a good one, the kind built over decades of careful living. Harriet had worked 31 years as a medical billing coordinator for a regional hospital in Duluth, Minnesota. She'd bought a modest 2-bedroom house on Clement Street when she was 38. She'd put money away every month. Not a lot, but enough. She'd done everything she was supposed to do. Then the hospital merged with a larger network out of Chicago, and the billing department was restructured, which was the word they used when they meant eliminated. Harriet was handed a severance package and a card signed by 14 co-workers, and that was that. 6 months later, the savings were gone. The house went into foreclosure in February. Her daughter, Becca, had offered the couch in her apartment in St. Paul. But Becca had a newborn and a husband working double shifts and an apartment the size of a parking spot, and Harriet had looked at that couch and known, without anyone saying it, that she couldn't stay there long. She'd left on a Thursday morning while Becca was nursing the baby, left a note on the kitchen counter that said, "Don't worry, I'll figure something out," and driven north on I-35 without a destination. She had $211, half a tank of gas, a sleeping bag in the trunk, and the particular kind of exhaustion that doesn't come from one bad day but from months of bad days stacking on top of each other until you can't remember what a good one felt like. She drove until the highway signs changed and the towns got smaller and the trees got thicker and the sky ahead turned the color of a bruise. The storm rolled in around 6 in the evening. Harriet pulled off Route 9 when she couldn't see more than 20 feet past the hood of her car. She'd meant to park at a rest stop she'd seen on the map, but she'd missed it in the white, and now she was on a county road she didn't recognize with snow coming down so hard it sounded like static on the windshield. She sat there with the engine running, watching the wipers lose their fight, and she thought, this is how people die. Not dramatically. Just like this. Parked on the wrong road. She had enough gas to run the heat for maybe 2 more hours. She turned on her phone's flashlight and got out. The cold was a physical thing. It pressed against her face and squeezed the air out of her lungs and made the world feel hostile in a way she hadn't experienced before, not even in all her years of Minnesota winters. This was different. This was the kind of cold that didn't care about you at all. She was standing there, uselessly shining her phone at the wall of white, when she saw the shape. It was to her left, maybe 40 feet into the tree line, a darker darkness against the dark. She almost didn't register it as anything. Her brain wanted to call it a boulder, a shadow, a trick of the light, but she kept looking at it and it kept having right angles. Buildings have right angles, nature rarely does. She walked toward it because there was nothing else to do. The structure emerged from the snow and the dark in pieces, first a roofline, then a wall, then a door. It was a small building, barely bigger than a garden shed, though sturdier. The logs it was made from were old, seriously old, the kind of old that meant someone had built this long before anyone thought to use machine-cut lumber up here. It had been built into the hillside behind it, which meant half the structure was essentially underground, insulated by the earth itself. That was why it had survived. That was why it was standing at all. The door was wood, heavy, reinforced with iron straps that had gone rust orange. There was no lock. Just an iron latch, the simple kind, the kind that said, "I trust whoever finds this." Or maybe just, "I didn't expect anyone to find this." Harriet stood in front of it for a moment. She thought about trespassing laws. She thought about whether there might be animals inside. She thought about how the temperature was still dropping and how her fingers had already gone past cold into that alarming numb stage. And she lifted the latch and pushed the door open. The smell hit her first. Old wood. Dust. Something faintly metallic. Decades of sealed air releasing all at once. She stepped inside. It was dark and it was cold, but it was not as cold as outside, and that difference, that small, measurable difference, felt like mercy. She swept her phone light around the interior. Single room. Wooden floor warped in places. A cast-iron wood stove in the corner, small but solid, with a stack of split logs beside it that looked to be a decade old at minimum. A cot frame with no mattress. A wooden shelf holding 3 tins, a folded wool blanket stiff with age, and a box of matches. She stared at the matches for a long moment. Then she crossed the room and opened the stove and found inside it a shallow bed of old ash, and beneath that ash a nest of perfectly dry tinder that someone had apparently left ready decades ago. Ready for whoever came next, or just never removed. It took her 4 matches to get a flame. The 5th one caught. Harriet Moss sat on the floor of that little room and fed wood to the fire, and listened to the storm outside, and thought about nothing and everything all at once. She was 53 years old. She had spent her entire adult life making sure other people's medical bills were coded correctly, and now she was here. And somehow the fire she'd built herself in a stranger's stove felt like the most competent thing she'd done in months. She wrapped the stiff wool blanket around her shoulders, and she cried a little, not dramatically, just the quiet kind, and then she stopped. In the morning, the storm had broken, and the world was white and impossibly still. Harriet wasn't sure what time she woke up. The fire had burned down to embers. Cold had crept back in around the edges. She lay there for a few minutes in the early grey light coming through a gap in the wall boards, and she looked at the ceiling and she thought, I need to leave. I need to go back to the car before someone sees it and calls in an abandoned vehicle. I need to. That's when she saw the box. She'd missed it the night before in the dark. It was set back beneath the wooden shelf, flat and rectangular, made of tin, the kind that might have once held tobacco or crackers or Christmas cookies. It had been shoved far enough back that you wouldn't see it unless you were lying on the floor at exactly the right angle, which Harriet had been. She reached under the shelf and pulled it out. It wasn't locked. The lid stuck, years of rust and cold, but it gave when she pried at it with her thumbnail. Inside, under a piece of oilcloth folded twice over, was a stack of papers. Letters, a small notebook with a leather cover gone black with age, and a photograph, oval-shaped, black and white, of a woman Harriet didn't recognize standing in front of what looked like this very structure, back when it was new and the trees around it were younger. Harriet sat down with the notebook. The handwriting inside was neat and old-fashioned, the kind of penmanship nobody was taught anymore. It belonged to someone named Walter Eugene Pratt, and according to the first page, he had built this structure in the autumn of 1951 as a hunting shelter on land he owned. 42 acres along the creek that ran east of Route 9. He'd used it seasonally for about 15 years. The notebook was half journal, half inventory. What he'd stored here, what he'd repaired, the dates he'd visited, brief notes on the weather. But near the end of the notebook, the entries changed. The last 3 pages were written in a different season, the handwriting a little shakier, the ink pressed harder into the paper, like something being said that had needed saying for a long time. Walter had written them in the summer of 1974, which meant he'd been coming out here for 23 years by then. June 14, 1974. I am writing this here, because I cannot write it at home. The boys know about the house and the accounts. What they don't know, and what I can't tell them directly without it becoming a battle, is that I intended this land, all 42 acres, to go to Edna and her children. Edna has never asked me for a single thing. That's exactly why she should have it. The deed is recorded at the county seat in Halverson under my name. The lawyer who handled it is James Coombs, though James has likely retired or passed by the time anyone reads this. There is also a lockbox, number 7 in the row, 3rd shelf from the bottom, at the Halverson Savings Building, Deantown, which I have maintained every year as long as I am able. In that lockbox is a second will, witnessed and signed, that supersedes what my sons believe to be the final document. I am leaving this note here because I trust the land to lead the right person to it. Anyone who finds this place found it the way I did, by needing it. Harriet read those words 3 times. She sat with the notebook in her lap, and the morning light coming in cold and thin through the gap in the boards, and she felt the particular disorientation that comes from realizing that the world you stepped into is not the world you thought. She didn't know who Edna was. She didn't know who the sons were. She had no idea whether James Coombs was alive or dead, or whether the Halverson Savings Building still existed, or whether any of this had been resolved decades ago, and she was just now stumbling across the paperwork of a long-settled estate. But she also knew what she'd read. She knew it was real, and she knew that leaving it here, just putting the lid back on the tin box and walking away, felt wrong, in a way she couldn't ignore. Halverson was a town. There were towns on the map that small. It might still be there. She tucked the notebook and the letters back under the oilcloth, replaced the lid, and put the tin box inside her coat. Then she went back to her car and drove. Halverson, Minnesota had a population of around 2,000, which was the kind of number that meant the library was also the historical society, and the county clerk's office was staffed by one person named Doris Tanaka, who was 64 years old, and had worked there for 31 years and knew the filing system the way other people know their own handwriting. Harriet walked in at 10:15 on a Tuesday morning, set the tin box on the counter and said, "I need to know if a man named Walter Eugene Pratt owned land on Route 9 and I need to know what happened to it." Doris looked at her for a moment, and there was something in her voice, not surprise exactly, but a kind of recognition. "Are you a relative?" "No. I found something of his." Doris came around the counter and looked at the tin box the way you look at something you haven't thought about in years but recognize immediately. "Walter Pratt died in 1979, she said. The land, the Route 9 parcel, was sold by his estate in 1981. His sons handled it. Did they know about a second will?" Doris was quiet for a long moment. "Come into the back," she said. What Doris knew, and what she'd kept to herself for 40 years, she admitted, because there was nothing she could legally do with it, was that there had been a dispute. Walter's two sons, Lawrence and George, had presented a will dated 1971 to the probate court. A woman named Edna Calloway had appeared with a letter Walter had given her, handwritten, saying that his intention was to leave her the Route 9 land. But a handwritten letter wasn't a legal document, and without a formal second will, the court had sided with the sons. The land was sold. Edna Calloway had moved away. Doris had always believed there was something more somewhere, because Walter Pratt was a careful man, not the kind who left things half-finished. "This," Harriet said, opening the tin box, "is what he left." The notebook sat on the table between them. Doris read the last 3 pages without speaking. When she finished, she looked up. "The lockbox," she said. "Number 7. Does the Halverson Savings Building still exist?" "It's a credit union now, but the lockboxes, the original ones, the old row. They kept them. Some people have been maintaining boxes in that building since the 50s. It's grandfathered in." She paused. "The bank would need legal authorization to open it. Who would have that authorization if the estate is technically closed?" Doris leaned back. "That," she said slowly, "is a question for an attorney. And I think I know which one." Martin Osey was 41 years old, 3rd-generation Halverson, and the only attorney in town who had both the patience for old estate law and the personal history with the Pratt family to understand why any of this mattered. His grandfather had been friends with Walter Pratt. He remembered as a child hearing his grandfather speak of a woman named Edna with a kind of quiet respect, a woman who deserved better than what she got. He sat across from Harriet in his small office above the hardware store on Main Street, and he read the notebook, and he set it down, and he said, "Where did you sleep last night?" "My car," Harriet said. He nodded like that didn't surprise him, and then he said, "Okay, here's what I'm going to do." What Martin did over the next 3 weeks was methodical and unglamorous. He filed a petition to reopen the estate on the grounds of newly discovered evidence. He subpoenaed the credit union to preserve the contents of Lockbox 7 pending court review. He tracked down Edna Calloway's surviving family. Edna herself had died in 2008, but she had a granddaughter, a woman named Lena, who was 37 and working as a nurse in Bemidji, and who, when Martin called her and explained what had happened, sat in silence for so long that he thought the call had dropped. "She always said there was land," Lena finally said. "She never talked about it much because it made her sad, but she always said there was land that should have been ours." The lockbox, when the court finally authorized its opening, contained exactly what Walter had described. A second will, properly witnessed, signed in August of 1974, naming Edna Calloway and her children as the beneficiaries of the 42-acre Route 9 parcel. It also contained a letter for whoever opened the box, written in the same careful hand as the notebook, which said, "If you are reading this, someone finally found the cabin. I always believed the land would choose its witness. Thank you for being honest." The son's Lawrence's estate, since Lawrence had died in 2003, and George, who was 82 and living in Phoenix, challenged the petition. George's attorney, a sharp-voiced man named Christopher Dean, argued that the statute of limitations on estate contests had long passed, and that the original probate proceeding was valid. Martin argued that fraud, even passive fraud, even the kind that consists of knowing there might be another will and declining to look for it, had no statute of limitations in this context. It went before a judge in Halverson County in late April. Harriet sat in the gallery. She'd been sleeping in Doris's spare room for 3 weeks by then, which was its own kind of improbable grace. She had no stake in the outcome, legally speaking. She'd handed over the notebook and the tin box and declined to be compensated for it, which Martin had told her was either very noble or very foolish, and possibly both. She watched George Pratt come in with his walker and his attorney, and his face set into the particular expression of a man who had spent 82 years being certain he was right. She watched Lena come in wearing scrubs, because she'd come straight from an overnight shift. Lena was tall and quiet, and she sat in the front row with her hands folded in her lap, and before the proceeding started, she turned and found Harriet's face in the gallery and gave her one small nod. The judge, a woman in her 60s named Sandra Holbrook, read the contents of the lockbox will aloud into the record. She asked whether there was any dispute about the authenticity of Walter Pratt's signature. Christopher Dean said there was not. She asked whether the 1971 will had been witnessed by the same notary. It had not. It had been witnessed by Lawrence Pratt, one of the 2 beneficiaries, which, Sandra Holbrook noted in a tone that left no room for interpretation, was a fact that should have received more scrutiny in the original proceeding. The land had been sold in 1981. It couldn't be returned, but its assessed value at the time of sale, compounded according to established legal formulas for unjust enrichment, was a number that made Christopher Dean's careful expression shift slightly when the court's accountant read it into the record. George Pratt looked at the floor. Lena kept her hands folded in her lap. Harriet watched all of it, and she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Not happiness exactly, but the satisfaction of a thing being made right. She thought about Walter sitting alone in that cabin in 1974, writing in a notebook, because he couldn't say what needed saying at home. She thought about Edna Calloway, dying in 2008, still carrying the quiet weight of something she'd lost and couldn't explain. She thought about land, about what it means to have a place in the world that belongs to you, that can't be taken. She thought about her house on Clement Street. In the weeks after the ruling, Harriet thought she'd simply move on. That had been the plan. Hand over what she'd found, let the right people deal with it, go figure out the next thing. She'd started looking at job listings in Duluth again, medical billing positions, a few remote roles, whatever she could find, but Lena called her. "I want to thank you properly," Lena said. "Can I take you to lunch?" They met at a diner in Bemidji on a Thursday afternoon. Lena had brought her mother, a quiet woman named Joyce, who was in her 60s, and who had the kind of eyes that look like they've already processed most of what life has to offer. They sat in a corner booth and ate soup, and Lena told Harriet about growing up hearing her grandmother mention the land, never with bitterness, always with that specific sadness of something almost within reach. She would have loved knowing it ended this way, Lena said. She would have loved knowing someone found it. Joyce looked across the table at Harriet and said, "What happens to you now?" Harriet told them the truth. Job Hunt. Start over. She'd done it before. Joyce and Lena exchanged a look. "I've been trying to open a care home," Joyce said. "Not a nursing facility. Something smaller. Transitional housing for women coming out of hard situations. I have the licensing almost in place. I have a building identified. What I don't have is someone who knows how to manage the financial administration side, the billing, the insurance coordination, the records." She paused. Edna would have said this was not a coincidence. Harriet looked at her soup. She thought about 31 years of medical billing. She thought about sleeping in her car. She thought about a tin box pushed back under a shelf in a hunting cabin built into a hill, and a man who had written, "I trust the land to lead the right person to it." She looked up. "When would you need someone to start?" she said. The home opened that September. They named it the Edna House, which was Lena's idea, and which Joyce had agreed to immediately, the way you agree to something you've been thinking without knowing it. It had 8 rooms. The first cohort of residents moved in on a Wednesday morning, 4 women in various stages of rebuilding, carrying bags and boxes and the careful expressions of people who have learned not to expect things to work out. Harriet ran the administrative side. She sat at a desk by the front window and coordinated insurance and handled intake paperwork and did the things she'd always done, except that now she could see the faces attached to the files. On the first night, after the last resident had settled and Joyce had gone home, Harriet sat alone at her desk in the quiet building and thought about the sequence of events that had delivered her here. A layoff, a foreclosure, $211, a wrong turn on Route 9, a storm, a door she hadn't been sure she had the right to open. She thought about Walter Pratt writing by hand in a notebook in a cold cabin, because some things can only be said when you're far enough from home to say them honestly. She thought about what it means to do the right thing, when doing the right thing costs you nothing and everything simultaneously. On her desk was a framed photograph. Lena had given it to her, a scan of the same oval portrait that had been in the tin box, the woman standing in front of the cabin when it was new. Edna Calloway as a young woman, before everything that came after. Harriet looked at that photograph every morning, not as a reminder of what she'd done, as a reminder of what ordinary people are capable of when they're paying attention. So here's what I want to ask you before you go. If you had been the one who pushed open that door, if you had found that tin box, that notebook, those final 3 pages, what would you have done? It would have been so easy to put the lid back on, to tell yourself it was none of your business, that it was ancient history, that you had enough problems of your own. Harriet Moss had $211 and no roof and a storm bearing down on her, and she still couldn't put the lid back on. That's the thing about people. Occasionally, when it matters most, we surprise ourselves. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs it today. And if you're new here, welcome to Keep the Drama. We tell stories worth telling. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one.